When we have a register break or a crack in the voice, we are acutely aware of its presence. Our voice keeps reminding us that it's there, and it can be very frustrating and discouraging. And so whenever we find something in our voices that isn't working correctly, isn't working properly, the first thing that we want to do is fix it. Seems very logical, seems like a very active approach to developing our singing voice and mastering that scale. And what I've discovered over the years from working with students and being in communication with singers from all over the world is that the number of proposed solutions to this problem are abundant. And so many singers have tried a lot of them. A lot of the singers that I've talked to and have been in communication with talk about how they've tried this and they've tried this and they've tried this and they've tried this. And what I've found is a lot of those approaches are really, we'll say, short-sighted. They really tend not to take into account the complexity of vocal registration. Oftentimes what they do is they focus on one aspect or another. And so let's say they focus purely on the physiological, but they ignore the acoustical or vice versa. And what ends up happening is it still creates problems, but just a different kind of problem with vocal registration. And so what happens is they get kind of an incomplete approach to this problem, an incomplete solution. And so whenever we're looking for solutions to vocal breaks, to registration issues, unevenness in the scale, we really need to look, we'll say, holistically. We need to understand what is happening on a physiological and an acoustical level. Because if we don't, what happens is we tend to use one of these approaches that just creates further imbalances. So for example, I've heard on forums and elsewhere people suggesting that we should just ignore the register break by carrying out that chest voice mechanism, that M1, as high up as we possibly can, and just dig into that sound and just use more effort, and then that problem will go away. And certainly it does cover up the fact that there's a register break, but all it really does is it postpones the inevitable. It just delays it. So now we get that break higher up in the scale, and we also run into the problem of having a sound that tends to be kind of shouty and like a yell, and we really have very little control over it because dynamically speaking it has to be loud in order to stay in that same coordination. And then we've had others who suggest that, oh, you should lighten and just let the voice kind of move into this lighter mechanism and, pull back, ease off on the gas, so to speak, ease off on the breath. And that also presents other problems because now what's happening is the vocal effort starts to decrease, and now we still have the same situation where we're having a break or a clunk. It just happens earlier in the scale. And so few of these approaches really look at the scale as requiring this dynamic flexibility, this adjustment of balance chromatically from note to note to note to note in the scale. And that's why I think so many of these approaches fail. Just so it's understood, these approaches aren't necessarily unique from one teacher or one method to the other. Sometimes singers just sort of intuitively try different approaches to see what works, and they just find that they're still, years later, still struggling with the exact same problem. Sometimes what we need to do is we need to look at vocal registration a little bit differently, and maybe even consider this idea, as crazy as it might seem, that maybe the voice is comprised of more than just two major registers with a couple on either side, and maybe we can start looking at the scale as being comprised of multiple registers that aren't defined purely in physiological terms, but also acoustical terms. Maybe we can look at every single note in the chromatic scale and see that each note has its own unique balance. And I think when we start looking at it that way, we don't get that disjointed kind of scale that we tend to have when we think more black or white, this or that. Alright, so in the upcoming weeks I do intend to record a number of videos on this topic of vocal registration, and in those videos I'm going to talk a little bit about resonance, vowel modification, as well as the interplay between breath pressure and glottal resistance efforts. And I hope that you will stay tuned for those videos, and if you haven't already done so and you're interested in seeing those videos, please consider subscribing to this channel so that you'll be notified when I post those videos. Thank you so much for watching.